The blood on the pristine Icelandic snow looked like scattered rose petals, entirely too delicate for the brutal reality of their situation. Kasia pressed her back against the frozen bark of the pine tree, listening to the heavy, synchronized breathing of the two people she hated most in the world, her husband, Benedict, and the woman he was sleeping with, Solveig. Just 24 hours ago, her biggest nightmare was the confirmation of their affair hidden in a decrypted file folder. Now, that same folder, containing manipulated climate data worth billions, was the reason armed men were hunting them through the merciless blizzard. She had to trust her husband's mistress to keep them alive, and her husband's lies to keep them from freezing. If stories of shattered trust, deadly secrets, and the chilling price of betrayal speak to you, pour yourself a glass of wine, turn down the lights, and stay with me. The silence of an Icelandic blizzard is not truly silent. It is a heavy, suffocating roar of wind that drowns out everything else, including the sound of your own heartbeat. Kasia knelt in the snow, her knees numb through the layers of her thermal pants, her lungs burning with every ragged breath she pulled in. To her left, Benedict was pressing a gloved hand against his ribs, his face pale and contorted in agony. To her right, Solveig was peering over the jagged edge of the ice crevasse, her striking Nordic features narrowed into a mask of pure, predatory concentration. They were hiding, hunted like animals in the sprawling, merciless white expanse just miles outside of Reykjavik. Kasia stared at the back of Solveig's head. The woman's blonde braid was crusted with ice. Just 48 hours ago, Kasia had thought Solveig was merely a charismatic local ski instructor, hired to guide them through the breathtaking landscapes of a desperate, healing retreat. Kasia had thought the worst thing about this trip was the suffocating, polite distance between her and her husband of 10 years. She had been profoundly, tragically wrong. Thwack! The sound of a suppressed bullet hitting the solid ice above them sent a shower of crystalline shards raining down on Kasia's hood. She flinched, biting the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper to keep from screaming. Benedict reached out, his hand trembling as he gripped Kasia's forearm. "Cass," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. "Keep your head down, please." Kasia looked down at his hand, the same hand that wore a platinum wedding band, the same hand she had seen in a high-resolution photograph on his encrypted hard drive, tangled in Solveig's blonde hair. The nausea that rolled through her stomach had nothing to do with the freezing temperatures or the men with assault rifles hunting them above. It was a deep, visceral rot. She yanked her arm away from his grasp as if he had burned her. Even now, with death literally walking above them in the snow, she couldn't stand his touch. "Don't," Kasia hissed, her voice venomous. Solveig slid back down into the trench, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She looked at Benedict, their eyes locking for a fraction of a second. It was a look of shared history, of intimate understanding. A look that belonged to a husband and wife, not a data analyst and a tour guide. "They have thermal optics," Solveig said in clipped, perfect English. "We can't stay here. The body heat will give us away." "Where do we go?" Benedict asked, his eyes darting to Solveig with a desperate reliance that made Kasia want to vomit. "There's a hunting cabin 2 kilometers east," Solveig replied, unholstering a flare gun she had taken from their emergency kit. "If we move through the tree line, we might break their line of sight." Kasia clutched her waterproof backpack tighter against her chest. Inside it was the backup drive containing the manipulated climate models, the reason the syndicate wanted Benedict dead, the reason they were all going to die out here. Benedict had sold the world's future for millions, and he had sold his marriage for the woman currently dictating their survival. "We follow her," Benedict said to Kasia, his tone pleading, begging her to understand the gravity of the moment. Kasia looked at the man she had loved for a decade, realizing she was staring at an absolute stranger. She had to follow her husband's mistress into the abyss, carrying the sins of his greed against her chest. "Lead the way," Kasia said quietly, her eyes dead and cold. 2 days earlier, the landscape of Iceland had seemed like a beautiful metaphor rather than a sprawling tomb. The drive from Keflavik Airport to their secluded resort in the Highlands was defined by a heavy, sterile silence. Outside the tinted windows of their rented SUV, jagged black volcanic rocks cut through endless fields of pristine white snow. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was equally frozen. Benedict sat in the passenger seat, his thumb rhythmically scrolling through encrypted emails on his phone. He was a climate data analyst, a man who built his career on predicting catastrophic shifts in temperature. Yet he remained entirely oblivious to the absolute zero dominating his own marriage. Kasia kept her hands on the leather steering wheel, her knuckles pale. This trip was supposed to be their final attempt at resuscitation. 10 years of marriage had slowly eroded into a polite, functional cohabitation, hollowed out by his late nights at the firm and her months-long documentary shoots abroad. They were here to reconnect, to strip away the distractions of their London lives. Yet, Benedict had barely looked up from his screen since they boarded the flight. "Are you expecting something urgent?" Kasia asked, her voice measured, careful not to sound accusatory. Benedict locked the screen instantly and slipped the phone into his wool coat. He offered a practiced, apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just tying up loose ends with the Geneva dataset. I want to be entirely present for this, Cass. For us." It was the right thing to say, but Kasia's instincts, sharpened by years of interviewing liars, politicians, and corporate criminals through a camera lens, registered a micro-expression of sheer panic before the smile took over. She nodded, keeping her gaze on the icy road ahead. They arrived at the lodge just as the pale Nordic sun began its early descent. The timber and glass structure was built directly into the mountainside, offering panoramic views of the very glaciers Benedict's models predicted would vanish in 50 years. Waiting for them in the warmth of the lobby's roaring stone fireplace was their assigned wilderness guide. Solveig was strikingly athletic, possessing the kind of raw, unpolished beauty that made makeup seem redundant. Her blonde hair was tied in a messy knot, and she wore a heavy-fitted fleece that highlighted a strong, capable frame. When she stepped forward to greet them, Kasia noticed the immediate shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. "Welcome to the edge of the world," Solveig said, her voice a low, melodic purr with a flawless command of English. She extended a hand to Kasia first. Her grip was firm, her palms calloused. "Kasia, thank you for accommodating us on such short notice," Kasia replied, offering a polite smile. Then, Solveig turned to Benedict. As a filmmaker, Kasia lived for the negative space, the unsaid words, the fractions of a second where human beings accidentally revealed their true selves. When Solveig's hand met Benedict's, there was no introductory hesitation. The handshake lingered a heartbeat too long. Solveig's eyes, a piercing glacial blue, did not hold the polite deference of a hired guide meeting a client. They held a territorial familiarity. "And you must be Benedict," Solveig murmured, the syllables of his name rolling off her tongue with a practiced ease. "Yes." Benedict cleared his throat, suddenly fascinated by the stitching on his leather gloves. "Beautiful place you have here. I'll have the staff take your bags to the private cabin," Solveig continued, her gaze remaining fixed on Benedict's face. "The altitude can be tough on the first day. Black coffee, no sugar, just the way to cut through the fatigue, yes?" Kasia froze, the warmth of the fire suddenly failing to reach her skin. Benedict drank black coffee, absolutely no sugar, a habit he only adopted 6 months ago after a consulting trip to Switzerland. He hadn't said a word to Solveig about beverages. Benedict stiffened, a flicker of genuine terror flashing across his features before he forced a nod. "That would be perfect. Thank you." Solveig finally turned her attention back to Kasia, flashing a brilliant, utterly hollow smile. "I will make sure you are both very well taken care of." Kasia did not smile back. The chill of the Icelandic wind had officially breached the thick wooden walls of the lodge, settling deep into her bones. She didn't know the exact nature of the secret yet, but her intuition screamed a devastating truth. This was not a meeting of strangers. The storm outside was a relentless force, battering the thick timber walls of their luxury cabin with terrifying violence. Yet, inside the bedroom, The most deafening sound was the steady, oblivious rhythm of Benedict's breathing. He was deeply asleep, his face relaxed against the feather pillow, looking exactly like the man Kasia had married a decade ago. But Kasia was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, the phantom echo of black coffee, no sugar, lingering bitterly in her mind. The suspicion had metastasized from a nagging doubt into a cold, hard certainty. She slipped out from under the heavy down comforter, the wooden floor freezing against her bare feet. Benedict's leather briefcase sat on the armchair by the window, moving with the practiced silence of a woman who spent her life observing others without being seen. She extracted his sleek, silver laptop. She took it into the en-suite bathroom, quietly pulling the sliding door shut before turning on the vanity's dimmest setting. The stark, blue glow of the screen illuminated her pale, drawn features. She knew his password wasn't going to be their anniversary. During the car ride from Keflavik, she had watched the reflection of his thumbs on the darkened window as he unlocked his device. 6 keystrokes. She typed in the date of his last solo consulting trip to Switzerland, 041-19. The screen unlocked. Kasia bypassed his standard desktop, navigating straight to the partition drive he claimed was strictly for proprietary firm data. During her last documentary on corporate espionage, a whistleblower had shown her how to unmask hidden directories. Her fingers flew across the trackpad, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She found a locked folder labeled simply Alpine. She expected to find the cliché artifacts of a cheating husband, forwarded itineraries, hotel receipts, perhaps desperate emails. She double-clicked the first file, a high-resolution JPEG. The image that bloomed across the screen forced all the air from her lungs. It was Benedict and Solveig. They were tangled together in crisp, white hotel sheets, his face buried in the crook of the blonde woman's neck. The timestamp reads 6 months prior. Geneva. The sheer intimacy of the photograph, the relaxed, possessive way his hand rested on her bare hip, was a brutal, physical blow. Kasia pressed her knuckles hard against her mouth to stifle the agonizing sob tearing up her throat. 10 years of loyalty, of building a life together, reduced to a digital file. But as her tear-filled eyes scanned the rest of the directory, her profound grief violently collided with a chilling, incomprehensible reality. There were no love letters. There were spreadsheets. Kasia opened a PDF. It was Benedict's master climate projection, the highly sensitive dataset used by international governments to regulate Arctic drilling. But the numbers were wrong. She watched as columns of data had been manually scrubbed and altered, artificially reducing the projected glacial melt by 40%. Beside the models were offshore bank transfer receipts from shell companies in the Cayman Islands, totaling nearly 8 million euros. She opened a decrypted email thread. Solveig's name was at the top, but there was no mention of a ski resort. Her signature read, Field Liaison. Solveig wasn't a mistress he had stumbled upon. She was a handler for a corporate syndicate. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It was a calculated method of control, a transactional tether to keep a greedy, compromised data analyst in line. A wave of nausea washed over Kasia. She was sleeping in a bed with a stranger who had sold the future of the planet, and they were currently isolated in the wilderness with his handler. Operating on pure, terrifying adrenaline, Kasia unzipped her waterproof gear bag and pulled out her high-capacity external hard drive. Her hands shook violently as she jammed the cable into the laptop's USB port. She highlighted the entire Alpine directory and dragged it to her drive. Copying. 15 seconds remaining. The progress bar crawled, mocking her panic. 10 seconds. 5. Suddenly, the shadow of a pair of feet appeared beneath the frosted glass of the bathroom door. A heavy floorboard groaned in the hallway. Benedict was awake. The digital progress bar on the screen hit 100% with an agonizing finality. The faint, metallic snick of the external hard drive ejecting felt louder than the wind outside. Kasia's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird as she quickly yanked the cable, shoving the small silver rectangle deep into the waterproof lining of her heavy parka. The frosted glass door handle turned slowly. Kasia Benedict's voice was sleep-thick, a low rumble from the hallway. "Are you all right in there?" She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, a woman utterly unmoored from the life she thought she had 10 minutes ago. She closed the laptop with trembling hands, forcing a breath deep into her lungs. "Just a headache, Ben. The altitude, I think," she called back, her voice remarkably steady. It was the same tone she used to placate difficult subjects during tense interviews. She opened the door, stepping out with the laptop tucked under her arm. Benedict stood in the dim corridor, silhouetted against the pale glow of the blizzard outside. He wore a rumpled gray t-shirt and loose sweatpants, rubbing his eyes like a devoted husband checking on his sick wife. For a split second, the sheer hypocrisy of the image almost broke her composure. The man who had sold out his career and his vows, playing the concerned partner while sharing a secret life with the woman sleeping in the next cabin. He reached out to touch her arm. "Come back to bed." Kasia flinched back instinctively, her skin crawling. "I couldn't sleep. I was going to read a bit in the living room." She deliberately set his laptop down on the hallway table, avoiding his gaze. Benedict frowned, a flicker of genuine anxiety crossing his features. "You took my laptop into the bathroom?" Kasia forced her eyes to meet his, locking onto the familiar brown irises that now felt entirely alien. "I needed to check an email about my edit back in London. Mine was dead." Before Benedict could press the issue, a sudden, blinding flash of white light illuminated the hallway. It was followed a fraction of a second later by a deafening, tearing sound, not the roar of the blizzard, but the horrific, staccato crack of high-velocity, suppressed gunfire. The large panoramic window in the living room shattered entirely, a hail of reinforced glass raining over the Persian rug. The heavy timber frame splintered as rounds chewed through the wood, missing Benedict's head by inches. Kasia screamed, dropping to the floor instinctively, her hands flying to cover her head. Benedict reacted with shocking speed, lunging forward and tackling her down into the narrow, sheltered space of the hallway, away from the exposed glass. "Get down," he bellowed over the sudden chaos, his voice raw with a terror she had never heard before. The air in the cabin was immediately sucked out by the freezing storm, replacing the warmth of the fireplace with a deadly, biting cold. More shots rang out, a methodical, sweeping burst that tore through the kitchen cabinetry. Kasia scrambled backward on her elbows, her mind racing. This wasn't a random attack in the middle of nowhere. It was a targeted hit. They had come for the data, or perhaps for Benedict himself. "Ben, what is happening?" she yelled, her voice trembling. Benedict didn't look at her. He was frantically crawling toward the coat rack by the destroyed front door, his eyes wide and panicked. "They found us. Oh God, they found us." "Who found us?" Kasia screamed, though the encrypted file she now carried in her coat already provided the terrifying answer. Before he could answer, the heavy wooden door of their cabin burst open. A figure stood in the threshold, silhouetted against the raging whiteout. Kasia instinctively braced herself for a final, lethal shot. But it wasn't a mercenary. It was Solveig. The blonde guide was fully geared up in heavy winter tactical wear, her face a mask of furious concentration. In her hands, she held a large-caliber rifle, entirely unlike the emergency flare gun she had carried during their orientation. She didn't look at Kasia. She looked directly at Benedict, her glacial eyes burning with terrifying clarity. "The Syndicate pulled the plug on the operation, Benedict. The cleanup crew is here. We have 90 seconds to run, or we die in this room." Kasia stared at the woman who had ruined her life, now holding the only weapon capable of saving it. The sickening reality snapped into focus. The betrayal was no longer just a digital file. It was a living, breathing nightmare, and Kasia was trapped squarely in the middle of it. The threshold of the cabin marked the boundary between a fractured marriage and a fight for sheer existence. As Kasia plunged into the Icelandic night, the blizzard swallowed them whole. The wind did not merely blow. It battered them with the kinetic force of a moving wall, driving microscopic shards of ice into every exposed millimeter of skin. Solveig took the lead, her movements terrifyingly efficient. The facade of the charming local guide was entirely gone, replaced by the grim, mechanical precision of a mercenary handler. She carved a path through the thigh-deep snowdrifts, her heavy rifle slung tight across her chest, shouting directions that were almost instantly snatched away by the gale. Kasia followed, her lungs burning as she struggled to match the operative's grueling pace. Hovering anxiously beside her was Benedict. He was entirely out of his element, a man accustomed to climate-controlled server rooms and luxury hotels. Now floundering in the very extremes, he spent his life quantifying on sterile spreadsheets. "Step in her tracks," Benedict yelled over the roar of the storm, reaching out to grab Kasia's elbow as she stumbled over a submerged volcanic rock. Even through the thick layers of Gore-Tex and insulated fleece, his touch sent a visceral shock of revulsion up her arm. It was a physical manifestation of the poison that had infected their decade together. Kasia violently jerked her arm away, the sudden, aggressive movement causing her to lose her footing entirely. She pitched forward into the freezing powder. "Cass!" Benedict was at her side in an instant, his gloved hands grasping her shoulders to haul her up. "Stop fighting me. I've got you." Kasia knelt in the snow, the biting cold seeping through her thermal layers, and looked up at the man she had loved. She saw the genuine panic in his brown eyes, the desperate, conditioned need to protect his wife. It was a staggering performance, rendered entirely pathetic by the encrypted hard drive currently pressing against her own ribs inside her parka. She wanted to scream the truth at him. She wanted to ask him how much the syndicate had paid him for the world's future, and how much they had paid Solveig to spread her legs in Geneva. But the faint, unmistakable crack of a rifle echoing through the howling wind swallowed her rage. Survival required silence. "Don't touch me," Kasia said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that cut through the storm with more edge than any shout. "Just keep moving." Benedict blinked, visibly wounded by her rejection, completely misinterpreting her disgust as mere panic from the gunfire. He nodded tightly, a muscle feathering in his jaw, and moved ahead to fall in line directly behind Solveig. Kasia forced herself to stand, her muscles screaming in protest. They formed a miserable, synchronized procession trudging up the incline of the glacier. The physical arrangement felt like a cruel, cinematic joke, Solveig forging ahead, the architect of this nightmare, Benedict trailing her like an obedient dog, and Kasia bringing up the rear, carrying the digital evidence of their combined sins. She watched the steady sway of Solveig's hips beneath her tactical gear, remembering the pale, tangled limbs in the hidden photograph. The affair had never been about love or even spontaneous lust. It was asset management. Benedict, in his supreme arrogance, believed he had conquered a beautiful, wild woman, when in reality, he had merely walked blindly into a perfectly laid corporate trap. As they crested a jagged ridge, momentarily shielded from the worst of the wind, Solveig dropped to one knee and raised a clenched fist to halt them. Kasia leaned heavily against a frozen boulder, her breath pluming in ragged bursts. She stared at her husband and his handler, acutely aware that the harshest element she faced tonight wasn't the sub-zero temperature, but the chilling realization that she was utterly alone in the dark. The ice cave was a jagged, sapphire-blue maw carved into the belly of the glacier, offering a terrifyingly beautiful, albeit temporary, sanctuary from the howling whiteout. The moment they crossed the threshold, the deafening roar of the blizzard was instantly muted, replaced by the eerie, hollow dripping of unseen meltwater. Solveig moved immediately to the entrance, her silhouette sharp against the blinding storm as she scanned the tree line below with the thermal scope of her rifle. Her presence at the mouth of the cave was a physical barrier, trapping Kasia and Benedict in the suffocating, freezing darkness. Benedict collapsed against the smooth, curved wall of ice, his breath tearing through his chest in ragged, desperate gasps. He pulled off his thick, insulated gloves, rubbing his freezing hands over his pale face. Kasia sank to her knees on the frozen floor, hugging her knees to her chest, the waterproof bag containing the hard drive pressing reassuringly against her sternum. The silence in the cavern was heavy, thick with exhaustion and the terrifying reality of what they had just escaped. Cass, Benedict whispered, his voice trembling violently, though whether from the cold or raw fear, she couldn't tell. Kasia, look at me. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the ground, tracing a fracture in the ice with her frozen boot. I have to tell you something, he choked out, the words tumbling from his blue lips in a rush of panic. He dragged himself across the uneven floor until he was kneeling just inches from her, the scent of fear and stale sweat radiating from his damp clothes. I lied to you. About the firm. About everything. Kasia finally raised her head. The darkness of the cave couldn't mask the absolute devastation etched into his features. This was the moment she had trained for in countless interviews. The crack in the armor, the spontaneous confession born of sheer terror. But this wasn't a subject. This was her husband. I know, she said quietly, her voice devoid of any warmth. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. Benedict recoiled slightly, confusion warring with the terror in his eyes. You know? The data, Kasia clarified, her tone remaining chillingly even. The models. The Cayman accounts. I saw it on your laptop before the cabin was hit. He squeezed his eyes shut, a pathetic sob escaping his throat. Cass, you don't understand. The firm, they were suffocating me. The funding was drying up. My models were being ignored by the board. These people, they offered me a way out. They offered us a way out. Millions, Kasia. Enough to never worry about a budget for your films again. Enough to what, Benedict? Kasia cut him off, the icy calm finally shattering as her rage surged to the surface. She leaned forward, her voice a venomous hiss that barely carried to Solveig at the entrance. Enough to buy a new life? Or enough to buy your silence while they manipulate global policy based on your fraudulent numbers? Benedict grabbed her forearms, his grip frantic and weak. I did it for us. The marriage was falling apart, Cass. I thought if I could just provide. Don't you dare put this on me, she snarled, ripping her arms from his grasp. The hypocrisy of his words was physically nauseating. He was trying to frame his colossal, greedy betrayal as an act of twisted devotion. She stared into his desperate, pleading eyes, the image of him tangled in Solveig's sheets flashing violently across her mind. He was confessing to treason, to corporate espionage, but he was still holding onto the ultimate lie. He was still trying to protect his affair. You did it for money, Benedict, Kasia whispered, the cold fury in her voice finally matching the temperature of the ice cave. And you did it because she told you to. She watched, with a sickening sense of vindication, as the blood drained completely from Benedict's face, leaving him paler than the snow outside. He knew exactly who she was. The silence in the ice cave was absolute, save for the ragged, panicked breathing of a man whose entire world had just violently collapsed. Benedict knelt frozen before Kasia, his jaw slack, the desperate justifications dying instantly in his throat. The raw, terrifying clarity in his wife's eyes completely shattered his delusion of control. She didn't just know about the data. She knew about Geneva. She knew everything. At the mouth of the cave, the faint crunch of heavy boots on ice signaled Solveig's approach. The blonde handler lowered her rifle, the thermal scope clicking off with a sharp, mechanical finality. She moved deeper into the blue shadows of the cavern, her face an unreadable mask of chilling professionalism. She stopped a few feet from where the couple knelt, the dynamic shifting violently from a rescue mission to an execution of trust. The storm is giving us cover, Solveig announced, her voice echoing coldly against the crystalline walls. But they are sweeping the ridge. We have maybe 20 minutes. Kasia did not look away from Benedict's horrified expression. She stood up slowly, her muscles screaming in protest against the biting cold, and turned to face the woman who had shared her husband's bed and brokered his soul. Is that the timeline they gave you, Solveig? Kasia asked, her voice laced with a dangerous, quiet venom. Or is that just how long you need to figure out how to hand him over without getting a bullet yourself? Solveig's glacial blue eyes flickered momentarily, a microscopic crack in her mercenary facade, before she leveled a hard stare at Kasia. I am trying to keep you both alive. What you know or think you know is irrelevant right now. Benedict scrambled to his feet, placing himself between the two women, a pathetic, desperate attempt to regain control of a narrative he had entirely lost. Cass, please. You have to listen to me. It wasn't what it looked like on the laptop. It meant nothing. It was just what Ben. Kasia interrupted, the sheer absurdity of his defense drawing a harsh, jagged laugh from her chest. Just asset management? Just a perk of the job while you sold out the global climate models for a Cayman account? She pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Solveig. Tell him how much they paid you to stroke his ego in Geneva so he would sign off on the manipulated projections. Benedict whipped his head towards Solveig, his eyes wide, pleading for a denial that would never come. Solveig, what is she talking about? The handler sighed, a heavy, exhausted exhalation that plumed white in the freezing air. The seductive, attentive ski instructor was completely gone, replaced by a woman who looked at Benedict with utter, calculating indifference. It was a vulnerability assessment, Benedict, Solveig said flatly, her tone devoid of any of the warmth he had mistaken for passion. You were a flight risk. The syndicate needed leverage to ensure you wouldn't back out once the funds were transferred. The affair was the leverage. Benedict stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck, his back slamming into the icy wall of the cave. The realization hit him with the force of an avalanche. The brilliant data analyst had been outsmarted, manipulated, and reduced to a compromised asset by the very woman he thought he was conquering. His betrayal of Kasia was entirely transactional. Kasia watched the devastation wash over him, feeling no triumph, only a hollow, sickening rot in the pit of her stomach. 10 years of marriage, destroyed not by a grand, sweeping romance, but by a corporate honey trap. You didn't just ruin our lives for money, Ben, Kasia whispered, the finality of her words hanging heavy in the freezing air. You ruined them for a lie you were too arrogant to see. Solveig raised her rifle, her jaw set with lethal purpose. The domestic dispute is over. We need to move, or we all die in this cave. But Kasia didn't move. She reached a hand inside her heavy parka, her fingers wrapping tightly around the hard, rectangular shape of the external drive. The ultimate leverage was no longer the affair. It was the data she had stolen. The faint, mechanical whine of a drone cut through the howling wind outside the ice cave, a sound that instantly vaporized the toxic tension between the three of them. Solveig moved with terrifying speed, slamming her back against the jagged blue wall near the entrance, her rifle raised. Thermal sweep, she hissed, her voice barely audible over the storm. They've tracked our heat signatures. We have less than a minute before they drop a flare. Kasia's hand tightened around the hard drive hidden inside her parka. The reality of their situation came crashing down with suffocating weight. The syndicate didn't care about the affair. They cared about erasing the only 3 people who knew the climate models were a multi-billion-dollar lie. Benedict, still reeling from the brutal exposure of Solveig's manipulation, stared blankly at the cave entrance. The arrogant data analyst who thought he could outsmart global policy was completely broken, replaced by a man staring into the abyss of his own catastrophic arrogance. He looked from Solveig, the woman who had orchestrated his downfall, to Kasia, the wife he had utterly destroyed. Cass, Benedict whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, devastating clarity. He stumbled toward her, grabbing her shoulders with a grip that was no longer frantic, but terrifyingly calm. The drive. You have it, don't you? Kasia froze, her eyes locked onto his. She didn't need to answer. He saw the confirmation in the rigid set of her jaw. They're going to kill us all to get it back, he said, his breath pluming rapidly in the freezing air. Solveig can't hold them off. We are trapped. So what do we do? Kasia demanded, her voice trembling, the sheer terror finally threatening to overwhelm her cold fury. Before Benedict could answer, a blinding red light flooded the mouth of the cave. A magnesium flare had been dropped just outside, casting long, demonic shadows across the ice. The scream of the wind was suddenly punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic crunch of tactical boots on the glacier. They're here. Solveig yelled, racking the bolt of her rifle. Get down. Benedict didn't drop. Instead, he unzipped his heavy parka and pulled out a small, satellite-linked emergency beacon he had packed for the trip. He activated it, the device immediately blinking with a bright, obnoxious green light, broadcasting their exact coordinates on an unencrypted frequency. What the hell are you doing? Solveig screamed, spinning toward him. You just painted a target on our backs. I painted a target on my back, Benedict corrected her, his eyes blazing with a desperate, manic resolve. He turned back to Kasia, his hands trembling as he reached out, not to hold her, but to push her toward the narrow, secondary tunnel at the rear of the cave that Solveig had dismissed as too small. Take the tunnel, Cass, he ordered, his voice breaking. It leads out to the ridge. You have the data. You have to get it to your server in London. Ben, no. Kasia started, her mind struggling to process his sudden shift from a cowardly traitor to a martyr. I sold our future, Kasia, he choked out, tears finally spilling over his freezing cheeks. I sold the world's future for a lie. This is the only way I can fix it. I'm going to run out there with the beacon. They'll follow the signal. They'll follow me. You're out of your mind, Solveig snarled, aiming her rifle toward the entrance as the first shadow of a mercenary appeared in the flare light. They'll gun you down in seconds. Buy her the time she needs, Solveig. Benedict roared, a sudden, commanding authority in his voice that Kasia had never heard before. Or you die in here with us. Without waiting for an answer, Benedict grabbed the blinking beacon, sprinted past Solveig, and hurled himself out of the cave into the blinding red storm. Gunfire erupted instantly, deafening and relentless. Kasia stared at the empty space where her husband had just been, the realization of his sacrifice hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She didn't have time to mourn, to forgive, or even to hate him anymore. She only had time to run. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire outside the ice cave abruptly cut off, replaced by the howling wind and a heavy, suffocating silence. Benedict's suicidal distraction had worked, drawing the Syndicate's kill squad away from the entrance and out onto the exposed glacier. But inside the cavern, a different, quieter kind of lethal tension instantly seized control. Solveig did not hesitate. She grabbed Kasia by the shoulder of her parka, her grip punishing and devoid of any lingering pretense of being a protective guide. Into the tunnel. Now, she ordered, her voice a sharp, commanding hiss that brooked no argument. Kasia stumbled forward, dropping to her hands and knees to crawl into the jagged, claustrophobic fissure at the back of the cave. The ice above them was barely inches from her skull, the air thick with the smell of frozen earth and ancient meltwater. The absolute darkness was terrifying, broken only by the dim, erratic beam of the tactical flashlight mounted on Solveig's rifle just behind her. As she scrambled through the freezing, narrow passage, Kasia's mind raced with horrifying clarity. Benedict was dead. He had traded his life for a few agonizing minutes of a head start. And now, she was trapped in a tunnel with the architect of his destruction, a woman whose loyalty was entirely transactional, dictated by whoever held the most leverage. Keep moving, Solveig commanded from the darkness, the flashlight beam sweeping impatiently over Kasia's boots. The extraction point is 3 kilometers west of this ridge. If we lose the storm cover, they will spot us with thermal drones before we reach the treeline. Kasia paused for a fraction of a second, her gloved hand slipping on a patch of slick ice. She felt the heavy rectangular weight of the hard drive thumping against her ribs. The data, the manipulated climate models that prove the Syndicate's multi-billion-dollar fraud. They won't just let us walk away, Solveig, Kasia gasped out, her breath pluming in the frigid air. They know you failed to contain Benedict. They know I have the drive. That is exactly why you need me alive, Solveig replied coldly, the flashlight beam remaining steady on Kasia's back. And why I need you. The chilling pragmatism in the handler's voice sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through Kasia's exhausted system. Solveig wasn't escorting her to safety. She was securing an asset. Kasia was merely the courier of the data the Syndicate desperately wanted back. As the tunnel finally began to widen, revealing a faint, gray sliver of the raging blizzard ahead. Kasia realized with terrifying certainty that Solveig's plan was never to escape together. The handler intended to trade the drive and Kasia's life in exchange for her own survival once they reached the extraction point. They emerged from the fissure onto a narrow, precarious ledge overlooking a sheer drop into a frozen valley. The wind immediately battered them, tearing at their clothes with vicious force. Solveig stepped out beside her, lowering the rifle slightly as she scanned the whiteout below. We follow the ridge down. The radio relay station is an hour away on foot. Kasia leaned against the frozen rock face, her mind working with the desperate speed of a cornered animal. She was a documentary filmmaker, accustomed to setting up hidden cameras, to capturing confessions, to weaponizing technology against those who thought they were untouchable. Slowly, deliberately, Kasia reached into the waterproof pocket of her parka, her fingers bypassing the hard drive and closing instead around the small, heavy satellite phone she had packed for remote shoots. She turned to face the blonde woman who had slept with her husband and orchestrated his death. The wind whipped Solveig's hair around her striking, emotionless face. "You're not taking me to a radio station, are you?" Kasia asked, her voice carrying a strange, calm authority over the roar of the storm. "You're taking me to a rendezvous point." Solveig's eyes narrowed, the rifle twitching slightly upward. The pretense of an alliance shattered completely in the freezing Icelandic air. The wind howled across the exposed ridge like a wounded animal, tearing at the heavy fabric of their parkas and threatening to pitch them into the blinding white abyss below. Kasia stood with her back pressed against the sheer face of the glacier, her gloved hand still buried deep inside her waterproof pocket, gripping the satellite phone. Solveig stood 3 feet away, the barrel of her high-caliber rifle no longer casually lowered, but pointed directly at Kasia's chest. The handler's face was a mask of cold, terrifying pragmatism, completely devoid of the forced camaraderie she had weaponized just hours ago. "You are very observant for a documentary filmmaker," Solveig shouted over the roar of the blizzard, her voice devoid of any warmth. "The rendezvous point is 5 kilometers south. The Syndicate's extraction team is waiting." We walk in, I hand them the drive and I walk away with my life and the rest of my fee. Kasia stared at the woman who had methodically dismantled her decade-long marriage. There was no hatred left in her, only a cold, clinical disgust that mirrored the freezing temperature of the air around them. Solveig was a professional parasite, feeding off the weaknesses of men like Benedict and discarding them when they became liabilities. "You think they're going to let you live after you failed to contain him?" Kasia challenged, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "You're a loose end, Solveig. You're as dead as he is." Solveig scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that was instantly snatched away by the wind. "I am an asset. You are a loose end. Hand over the drive, Kasia. Now." Kasia slowly pulled her hand from her pocket. She didn't hold the silver rectangle of the hard drive. Instead, she held the bulky, black satellite phone. The small screen was illuminated with a bright green light, indicating an active, unencrypted transmission. Solveig's eyes narrowed in confusion, then widened in sudden, absolute terror as she recognized the blinking icon. "What did you do?" she screamed. "I didn't bring this just to call my producer in London," Kasia yelled back, her voice ringing with the final, desperate triumph of a woman with nothing left to lose. "I activated the emergency broadcast frequency 5 minutes ago in the tunnel. I've been broadcasting our exact GPS coordinates to the local Icelandic search and rescue, and to the open channel the Syndicate mercenaries are using." Solveig lunged forward, a feral snarl twisting her striking features. "You stupid bitch. You just called the kill squad right to us." "I called them to you," Kasia corrected her coldly. Before Solveig could raise the rifle to fire, the deafening, unnatural crack of high-powered sniper fire echoed across the valley, entirely distinct from the howl of the storm. A high-velocity round struck the solid ice just inches from Solveig's boot, sending a shower of razor-sharp shards into the air. The Syndicate hadn't waited for her at the rendezvous point. They had tracked the satellite ping and were already sweeping the opposite ridge. Solveig spun around, her tactical training overriding her rage as she dropped to one knee and aimed her rifle across the chasm, desperately searching for the muzzle flash in the whiteout. But the gunshot had triggered something far more lethal than a mercenary's bullet. A deep, groaning rumble vibrated through the soles of Kasha's boots, a sound so massive and ancient it felt like the mountain itself was tearing apart. The heavy, unstable snowpack above them, disturbed by the concussive force of the gunfire and the raging blizzard, finally gave way. Avalanche! Solveig screamed, her voice completely swallowed by the apocalyptic roar descending from the peaks. Kasha didn't look up. She scrambled backward, wedging herself deep into a narrow, vertical crevice in the rock face, just as a towering wall of white fury exploded over the ridge. The force of the snow was unimaginable, a kinetic tidal wave of ice and pulverized rock. Kasha pressed herself flat against the freezing stone, closing her eyes as the world turned into a deafening, crushing white void. She heard Solveig scream, a brief, ragged sound of absolute terror before the handler was violently swept off the ledge and swallowed by the relentless, churning mass of the avalanche. The silence that followed the avalanche was not peaceful. It was absolute, suffocating, and profound. Kasha lay entombed in a cocoon of packed snow within the narrow rock crevice. Her lungs burned with every shallow, ragged breath she forced into the freezing darkness. For an agonizing stretch of time, she existed only as a heartbeat, a singular point of warmth in a world that had been violently erased. Panic, primal and desperate, finally surged through her numbed limbs. She clawed at the heavy, white wall pressing against her face, her insulated gloves tearing at the crystalline block. It felt like digging her way out of a grave. With a final, desperate heave, her hand broke through the surface. The biting, razor-sharp wind of the Icelandic night immediately rushed into the small opening, carrying with it the faint, sickly sweet smell of ozone and pulverized pine needles. Kasha hauled herself upward, her muscles screaming in protest, until her head and shoulders cleared the snowpack. She collapsed onto her chest, gasping for air that felt like inhaled shards of glass. The landscape before her was unrecognizable. The sheer, treacherous ridge where she had stood with Solveig moments ago was gone, sheared off by millions of tons of ice and rock. The valley below, once a rugged expanse of volcanic stone, was now a smooth, terrifyingly pristine white tomb. The blizzard had miraculously begun to thin, the howling wind dropping to a low, mournful moan. Kasha dragged herself fully out of the snow, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. She scanned the devastated expanse, her eyes searching the pale, moonlit canvas for any sign of movement, any flash of Solveig's tactical gear, or the bright green blink of Benedict's decoy beacon. There was nothing. The woman who had orchestrated the destruction of her marriage, and the man who had traded his soul for a lie, were buried beneath 50 feet of impenetrable ice. The syndicate mercenaries, too, had likely been swept away or forced into retreat by the sheer scale of the natural disaster. Kasha fell to her knees, the waterproof pocket of her parka heavy against her ribs. She slowly unzipped it and pulled out the small, silver hard drive. The metal was freezing against her palm. Inside this tiny rectangle lay the irrefutable proof of a multi-billion-dollar corporate fraud, the manipulated climate models that had cost Benedict his life and Solveig her fee. She stared at it, waiting for the righteous vindication of a seasoned investigative journalist to wash over her. She waited for the adrenaline of securing the story of a lifetime to eclipse the horror of the last 4 hours. Instead, a hollow, echoing void opened up inside her chest. She was alive. She had won the deadly game of cat and mouse. But the victory tasted like ash and copper. She thought of the encrypted photograph on Benedict's laptop, the way his hand had rested so possessively on Solveig's bare hip in Geneva. She thought of his desperate, pathetic confession in the ice cave, and his final, suicidal sprint into the flare light to buy her time. He hadn't loved Solveig, but he hadn't loved Kasia enough to protect their life together from his own greed. And Solveig hadn't loved him at all. She had merely managed an asset until he became a liability. Kasia knelt in the snow alone, the silence ringing in her ears. She was a survivor, clutching the devastating truth of a global conspiracy, but her heart was entirely, irrevocably frozen. The radiator beneath the window hissed, radiating a steady, artificial heat that entirely failed to reach the marrow of Kasia's bones. It had been 72 hours since the blinding beam of an Icelandic search and rescue helicopter had cut through the storm, finding her half-frozen and clutching a silver hard drive on the edge of the shattered ridge. 72 hours of sterile hospital lights, metallic thermal blankets, and endless, measured statements given to international authorities. She had handed over the data. By now, the decrypted files were spreading across secure journalistic servers in London like a digital wildfire, systematically burning down the syndicate and the fraudulent climate models her husband had died to protect. But in the quiet, suffocating isolation of her upscale Reykjavik hotel room, the victory felt entirely devoid of triumph. It was a Pyrrhic victory in its purest, most devastating form. Kasia stood alone, wrapped in a thick white hotel robe, staring out the floor-to-ceiling glass window. Beyond the pain, the city was blanketed in a fresh, undisturbed layer of morning snow. It looked peaceful, pristine, and utterly merciless. It was the exact same shade of blinding white that had violently swallowed Benedict and his handler. The local authorities had officially called off the recovery effort at dawn. The avalanche had compacted millions of tons of ice and rock to the density of concrete. There would be no bodies to recover until the spring thaw, if ever. Benedict, the brilliant data analyst who had arrogantly tried to manipulate the Earth's temperature for profit, was now a permanent part of the very glacier he had sold out. And Solveig, the calculating operative who had weaponized intimacy to broker his soul, was entombed right beside him. Kasia raised her left hand, resting her fingertips against the freezing glass. The platinum wedding band caught the pale, sterile light of the room. 10 years. A decade of shared coffee cups, late-night conversations, and quiet compromises, all culminating in a violently shattered illusion. She had survived a mercenary kill squad and the brutal force of nature, but the true, fatal blow had been delivered in the silent glow of a laptop screen when she first saw the photograph from Geneva. The physical danger was over, but the psychological haunting had permanently settled into her chest. She slowly curled her fingers into her palm, feeling the cold metal press into her skin. She didn't feel the searing heat of anger anymore. The raging blizzard of betrayal had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a vast, frozen wasteland of acceptance. Benedict had not been a criminal mastermind. He had been a foolish, weak man who traded his integrity for an illusion of power and an orchestrated affair. And in his final, desperate moment, he had tried to buy it all back with his blood. It was a pathetic, tragic equation that yielded nothing but ghosts. With deliberate, agonizingly slow movements, Kasia slid the platinum band off her ring finger. It felt unnaturally heavy as she set it down on the cold marble of the windowsill. It sat there, a small, gleaming artifact of a life that no longer existed, entirely dwarfed by the endless, freezing expanse of the Icelandic winter outside. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, stepping back from the glass. She had the story of a lifetime. She had survived the abyss. But as she stood in the perfect silence of the empty room, looking out at the endless snow, she realized the ultimate, chilling truth of her survival. The cold doesn't kill you. It's the hope that someone will keep you warm that does.